Alright, let's move on to the next concept in our discussion about ecosystem basics. I'm trying to get a basic understanding of ecosystems. The next topic here is called ecosystem components. Alright, and the components within an ecosystem is critical in understanding what's happening within an ecosystem. And you can break this down by talking about ecosystem components that are biotic and abiotic. So for those of you who had bio, everybody should have bio, now you think about it. Alright, you remember biotic as being the living components, and the abiotic as being the non-living components. The living components are pretty easy to understand. Alright, a lot of life out there in ecosystems, a lot of diversity, everything from bacteria, the decomposers, to the fungus and the algae, all the way up through the food chain to your top carnivores and predators. Alright, everything that's living. The abiotic factors, or the abiotic components, are the ones I want to stress here because they're the ones that we don't typically think about when we're talking about and trying to understand ecosystems. All right, remember, ecosystems are interactions and relationships between the living and the non-living components. So take a look at this figure down here in the bottom right. All right, and I'll minimize this and try and brainstorm the different non-living factors. All right, try and understand the abiotic parts of this ecosystem because those are the ones that end up to be what we're going to call limiting factors. All right, and limiting factors, I can define it here for those of you who like definitions. So a limiting factor is usually an abiotic component of an ecosystem that limits population growth. All right, so what are the non-living components in the bottom right picture? All right, just take a moment to think about that. You could pause the video if you like. Alright, but we're going to move on here and talk about the sun and the sunlight itself. Alright, sunlight that's so important for photosynthesis can become a limiting factor. It's an abiotic component. It's non-living. But if trees provide too much shade, they limit the amount of sunlight that reaches the surface of the earth. They limit the amount of sunlight that other plants can receive. So that can become a limiting factor. The amount of precipitation. Alright, the air itself and the temperature of the air can become a limiting factor. Alright, think about climate change. Alright, water. The amount of water, the placement of it, alright, it being clean can become a limiting factor. Alright, the slope of the land is non-living. Alright, the rocks that are exposed to weathering and erosion that provide nutrients can become a limiting factor. The type of soil, all right, the soil texture, the quality of the soil can become a limiting factor. So all kinds of non-living abiotic components of an ecosystem. All right, these are the ones that can become limiting factors and can really but limit population growth. So these are the ones we want to be able to understand and be aware of. Alright, so ecosystem components as being biotic and abiotic. And then we could talk about something called the law of tolerance. Alright, and I'm going to move on to the next slide to talk about this. I like this one a little bit better. When we talk about the law of tolerance, I'm going to write it up here. You can put this in your notes. Alright, I will give you the definition for law of tolerance, which I'll explain using this graph in a second. The law of tolerance is an organism's success is based on a complex set of conditions, and there's a minimum, an optimum, and maximum environmental combination of factors that determine success. So, an organism's success depends on a complex set of conditions, and there's a minimum, optimum, and maximum environmental combination of factors. Alright, sounds very complicated, so let's go through this and gather an understanding of this concept, the law of tolerance. So let's say you have a limiting factor, alright, a limiting resource, and that limiting resource or that limiting factor is temperature. Let's use temperature. Alright, take a look here, and here you have organisms are abundant. Okay, so let's say there's an organism, and within this range of temperature, alright, within this range of temperature is the organism's optimum range. Okay, so let's say at those temperatures, whatever this temperature is to whatever this temperature is, that's its optimum range. And that's where the fitness, all right, the ability of an organism to survive and reproduce is at its maximum. All right, between that range. That's called the optimum range. All right, now as soon as you get outside of the optimum range, all right, there's a temperature here, and as soon as you get outside of that range, whether it be cold or warm in this case with our temperature example, you enter an area of stress. All right, they call it the stress zone. All right, so you'll have less organisms because now the organism is stressed, you have less organisms. Okay, you're outside of the optimum range. All right, so as soon as the population is stressed, the population will decrease on both sides of that limiting factor. Now, there'll be at some point down in here where you're going to enter into what's called the zone of intolerance, all right, or what we like to call the limit. All right, you've reached the limit, the zone of intolerance, where there will be no organisms. Okay, once you've gone beyond the stress zone, now you're outside of that organism's ability to survive, all right, in regards to temperature in this case. All right, so you're past the extreme of where it can survive, and whether it be cold or hot, you have no organisms. All right, so that's pretty much it. That's what the law of tolerance states, that an organism's success depends on a complex set of conditions, and there's a minimum, optimum, and maximum environmental combination of factors. All right, now this is interesting because we as humans change a limiting factor. We a lot of times are responsible for pushing a limiting factor outside of its zone of stress and into the limit, into the zone of intolerance. All right, and that's when species go extinct, all right, due to human actions, whether they're known or unknown, direct or indirect. All right, we have a tendency to push limiting factors outside of the optimum range and into stress zones and into the zone of tolerance. So think about that as we move through this course, and hopefully you're getting an understanding of these basic concepts. All right, here's an example of what I'm talking about. We're going to look at fish. Let's say we have a river here. All right, and the rainbow trout, its optimum temperature range is somewhere around 10 degrees Celsius. All right, that's where it thrives. That's its optimum range. Now, let's say we have an industry, a coal-fired power plant, is using water from the river to turn to steam, to turn a turbine, to generate energy. All right, and then what it's doing is it's taking that water, which is now scalding hot, and it's releasing it back into the river. So what we have here is thermal pollution. Water that is now hot is being re-entered into the ecosystem, in this case the river, and what it's doing is it's causing the temperature to go up of the river, and now we see it's in the 30 range, all right, which is outside of the zone of tolerance. All right, now we're in the zone of intolerance of rainbow trout. Here's its cutoff, and we have a change in fish. All right, now you have bass taking over the river in that area of thermal pollution. All right, because of humans pushing this limiting factor into the stress level and then out of the stress level into the zone of intolerance. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. So let's move towards finishing up. Okay, these concepts in a basic understanding of ecosystems and their components. All right, so let's take a look at the biotic components of an ecosystem, and they are based on how they obtain energy. All right, this is the last concept here that we'll talk about, and the living components. All right, we're using the word biotic to mean living components of an ecosystem. We talked about the non-living, and the living components are based on how they obtain energy. The first type of organisms we're going to talk about are called autotrophs. All right, autotrophs. All right, they make their own energy. They make their own energy. And they do that in two ways. The first way is through photosynthesis, using sunlight for energy. All right, they're taking in carbon dioxide and water, using sunlight as the energy source, and they're releasing oxygen. All right, that's the one we're all used to and we're all familiar with. The second type of autotroph, they obtain their energy through chemosynthesis. All right, not photosynthesis, but chemosynthesis. All right, they obtain their energy through chemicals or minerals. And I have an example here of this, what's called a tube worm. All right, and these tube worms are an example of what's called an extremophile. These extremophiles live in extreme environments, extreme ecosystems. All right, and they use chemosynthesis to obtain energy. All right, so these tube worms are living at volcanic vents deep underwater, all right, at tectonic plate boundaries, and we really didn't know about them until fairly recently. All right, and what they do is at these volcanic vents, the volcanic vents are spewing all kinds of rich minerals and nutrients, and one of them is sulfur. All right, and these tube worms are taking the sulfur out of the water and using it for energy through chemosynthesis. All right, it's very interesting because these extremophiles make up almost 1/3 of the life on the planet, and we didn't really know about them until fairly recently. All right, so it's an interesting discussion too, because we used to think that life needed light, and here's an example of a life form that does not need light, and it lives in extreme pressures. All right, it's getting its energy through chemosynthesis, not photosynthesis. So if there's life on other planets, let's say under the ice ocean on Europa, the moon of Jupiter, where environments are very similar to this, all right, there's volcanic vents under those oceans on Europa, there probably is life like this on other planets. All right, chemosynthesis, organisms obtaining energy through chemicals or minerals. So there you go, those are the autotrophs, the organisms that obtain energy on their own, they make their own energy. And the other type of biotic component for ecosystems are your heterotrophs. All right, those that cannot make energy on their own, so they must consume energy from somewhere else. All right, and there's all kinds of different types here. You have herbivores that eat plants to get their energy. Then you have your carnivores, which are your meat eaters. You have omnivores, which do both. All right, they eat both plants and animals. And just to kind of give you an example here, herbivore, deer is an herbivore. They eat only plants. There you go. There's your meat eater. Bear is a great example of an omnivore. They eat both plants and animals, as do you. All right, then I'm going to go down here to detritivore. All right, they eat detritus, and I love this word. Detritus is something you should be aware of. All right, it is basically dead plants, organic material. You can think about what soil horizon would you expect to be rich in detritus. It's a very important soil horizon. It's important for many, many reasons, including the amount of detritus, the amount of organic material, and that's the O horizon. Right? But detritivore are those little critters that feast on dead plants and dead organisms. You're talking about like your pill bug, all right, your earthworm, all right, very important part of an ecosystem. It breaks those bigger things down. It takes larger materials, breaks them down, and then they get broken down more by decomposers. All right, and your decomposers are your mushrooms, your fungus, your bacteria, and so forth. All right, so those are your heterotrophs, those organisms that consume to obtain energy. So that was a lot of information. You now know what an ecosystem is and how its components interact. That's the first step in a long process to understand how our natural world functions and how we humans impact it. All right, we can't understand how we impact the environment, ecosystems, species, unless we know how ecosystems work. So you did a great job, and I'll see you back here for another lecture for the AP Environmental Science classroom.